Welcome to the PCN Capitol Preview. I'm Larry Casper. Our topic today is the environment in Pennsylvania. Join our discussion by calling us at 1-877-PA6-5001 or text us at 717-219-4001. We'll also take your questions from PCN's Facebook page submitted earlier today. First, we're joined by Mark Levy, reporter for the Associated Press. You wrote that an election for PA Supreme Court is usually a sleepy affair, but that was not the case last week. Mark, what energized that race?
Right. Well, a couple things, but the underlying cause is that partisans on both sides have realized the importance of controlling courts at all levels in states, and so we've seen races for high court in states become very partisan, very expensive affairs. I mean, it was in April that Wisconsin Supreme Court race was a $50 million race. That translated over into Pennsylvania's race for a Supreme Court seat in the fall that cost well over $20 million. That smashed the state record. It drew national media coverage. And Dan McCaffrey, the Democrat, did something that we haven't really seen on the campaign trail in the judicial race, which is that he brought issues into the race. He talked about how the U.S. Supreme Court was, in the view of Democrats, rolling back rights that Democrats had fought for, and that made the state Supreme Court and courts everywhere that much more important to fill the vacuum and defend those rights at the state levels. It's starting to resemble the more conventional political races we've seen for governor and U.S. Senate, like I said, where you see national media coverage, you see a lot of money being raised and spent, TV ads and whatnot in these races.
Mark, how did the spending compare between the two candidates in this race, McCaffrey and Carluccio?
So final reports haven't been filed. My tally to date was about $13.5 million spent by Dan McCaffrey, the Democrat, as well as groups that were on his side, whether it was lawyers, whether it was labor unions. And on Carluccio's side, about $9.5 million, and that includes her and allies, such as business organizations, the Pennsylvania Chamber of Business and Industry, the Hospital and Health System Association, and Commonwealth Leadership Fund were spending significant amounts on her behalf.
A minute ago, you said that the judicial candidates, or rather Dan McCaffrey, brought issues to this campaign. And as you know, the judicial candidates are limited somewhat in what they can talk about while campaigning. Tell us about that.
Right. So traditionally, candidates have been reticent to discuss issues on the campaign trail, saying that, well, this could be something that comes before us. And Dan McCaffrey sort of walked a fine line on that, saying, look, I'm a Democrat and you deserve to know what I stand for because I'm running for office. And he talked about rights that he supports that, for instance, the U.S. Supreme Court has stripped away, such as affirmative action, such as abortion rights, such as labor, voting, LGBT rights. And he talked about those in the context of, if you're voting for state Supreme Court, do you want your state Supreme Court to stand up for those rights? And it was a stark difference between races of the past, where really candidates on the trail were winking at interest groups to get their endorsements, but not really full-throatedly talking about these issues. So Carolyn Carluccio on the Republican side, while she tried to avoid discussing issues, she was also endorsed by gun rights groups and anti-abortion groups because she had answered their questionnaires in the way that they wanted to see.
Now, there was a TV spot, as you know, that claimed Carluccio erased her anti-abortion position from her website. And how much did that claim register with voters?
So there was some wording erased from her website after the primary that talked about defending all life under the law. In the primary, they put it up there, her campaign put it up there as sort of a wink and a nod to the anti-abortion lobby, which is an important part of the Republican electorate. After the primary, they took it off the website. And the groups that were supporting Dan McCaffrey, labor unions, trial lawyers, for instance, set up groups, or like focus groups of voters, undecided voters, where they talked about, would you support someone who opposes abortion? Would you support someone who tries to hide their position on abortion? And they found that voters in those groups had a very visceral reaction to someone trying to hide their position on it. And so you saw that contention underlie millions and millions of dollars of TV ads and flyers that were going out across the state. It became a very, very key avenue to attack Carolyn Carluccio.
Mark, there was another TV spot that supported Carluccio, and it tried to connect McCaffrey with his brother's lewd emails. And how did voters react to that claim?
You know, it's not clear to me. I don't have any independent research on that, but I can at least explain the ad that the idea was that Dan McCaffrey, at one point after he became a Philadelphia judge, did receive a couple emails from his brother of the private nature and told his brother not to send them to his judicial account. Dan McCaffrey says they weren't lewd in nature; they were just of a personal nature. But the subtext here is that his brother was a Supreme Court justice and did end up resigning amid an email scandal that touched all three branches of government.
So how much did spending in this race, Mark, affect the outcome for PA Supreme Court?
You know, it's hard to tell what motivates voters, but, you know, we can point to turnout was 35% across the state. That's the highest we've seen in a couple decades. Department of State records before 2000 are all on paper and hard to access. But from what we know from online records, that is the highest odd year turnout for a judicial election since 2000. And look, you know, the sides obviously believe that spending money helps their cause. Otherwise, they wouldn't have spent millions of dollars.
Last question, Mark. How likely is it that future judicial elections will continue to spend big money as McCaffrey and Carluccio did last week?
So the people who were part of advocating for candidates and spending money and on the ground trying to organize staff and volunteers to phone bank and meet voters and door knock obviously believe that there's no turning back. Now, they may blame the other side. Republicans may blame Democrats for this. Democrats may blame Republicans for this. But if what we saw in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania this year is any indication, court races across the nation will become hyper-politicized in the coming years.
Mark Levy, reporter for the Associated Press, thank you very much. The PCN Capitol Preview returns after a short break.
Do you love high school sports? Then get ready for a championship weekend on PCN. Kick off the weekend with live coverage of the PIAA Soccer Championships on November 17th. November 18th, PIAA Soccer Championships continue live on PCN. Then stay with PCN for the PIAA Girls Volleyball and Field Hockey Championships on November 19th. PCN is Pennsylvania Sports. For 25 years, PCN and the PIAA have partnered to bring you the state high school football championships. 25 years and the best teams and players from across the state have participated in the PIAA football championships. You can catch a future star on PCN. Join PCN starting on December 7th for 3 days, totaling 6 live games on PCN Select and on cable. PCN is Pennsylvania Sports.
Welcome back to the PCN Capitol Preview. Both our guests are majority chairs of the environmental committees in Pennsylvania's legislature. Greg Vitale chairs the House Committee, and Gene Yaw chairs the Senate Committee. Manufacturing hydrogen gas is coming to Pennsylvania, and before we consider the possible environmental impact, what are the circumstances that are making this industry possible here in Pennsylvania? Senator Yaw, I'll start with you.
Well, I mean, we've talked about carbon capture, that type of thing. Actually, as part of the whole hydrogen hub, carbon capture is very, very important. And I mean, there's a national, I mean, the federal government has promoted this, and there's billions of dollars, frankly, out there. There have been a couple of applications for hydrogen hubs here in Pennsylvania. We have one in the Philadelphia area and part of one in the western part of the state. But the whole idea is to produce clean energy or decarbonize whatever the fuel is, whether it's methane or anything like that. And when you burn hydrogen, if my recollection is, you get water vapor mainly as the main byproduct. So that's it. It's a national effort to do that. And I'm glad to see Pennsylvania is part of that. We have a lot of work to do, obviously. One of the things that I said is carbon capture, which we happen to start developing some of the carbon capture legislation, I think 2 years ago. But that is part of what do you do with the carbon that you take out of whatever the feedstock is. And there's some issues over that as to how, I mean, the idea is to inject this excess carbon dioxide into the ground.
Representative, tell us your reaction to all this federal money flowing in for these hydrogen projects in Pennsylvania.
Right. Well, climate change is the most serious long-term threat to this planet. And Pennsylvania is a major greenhouse gas producer, producing, the fourth among states in this country, greenhouse gas production. And climate scientists recognize that hydrogen is one of the tools in our toolbox to deal with this. Although broadly speaking, it's important to move away from fossil fuels. There's this recognition that there are certain segments of the economy that really can't be electrified, and they include things like air travel, long-distance trucking, manufacturing of cement, steel. So hydrogen is thought of as something that can be used to do that. Now, hydrogen, the key point here, I think, is when you produce hydrogen, you're using some other fuel. Our Mach 2 plant program in the eastern part of the state.
Did you say Mach 2 program? What is that?
The Mach 2 hydrogen hub proposal. Two proposals were accepted. Two applications were accepted by the federal government to receive money. In the eastern part of the state, Pennsylvania, along with some other states, have an application that does not use fossil fuel, that uses nuclear, that uses renewables. Now, the Arch 2 in the western part of the state uses natural gas as a feedstock to create the energy to split the molecules and make the hydrogen. Now, the key point with regard to hydrogen and its manufacture is it can be done the right way as a tool to combat climate change, or it can be done the wrong way to perpetuate fossil fuels. And the hearing we recently held yesterday and the legislation I introduced is designed to make sure that hydrogen is a tool to address climate change. And by that, it means limiting the use of hydrogen to just these hard to decarbonize sectors and making sure that when you're using natural gas as a feedstock, that you are taking a good percent, 90% of the CO2 out of the burning of fossil fuels, and as the senator mentioned, capturing it in some way.
So the environmental impact depends on how you make the hydrogen?
Well, there's a bigger supposed environmental impact, which people don't like to talk about, but the hydrogen hub is going to be dependent on pipelines. And there's 3 places where pipelines need to be used. It needs to be used to bring in the feedstock if it's going to be methane gas or whatever else.
Do they have to be built from scratch, this whole network?
The whole network does, and we're talking about maybe, we had a hearing about the whole idea of carbon capture and everything, and I think in that hearing it said one of the presenters said we need 100,000 miles of pipelines for carbon capture. Well, we need pipelines for carbon capture to take the carbon away. We need pipelines to bring it in, and then we need pipelines to, if hydrogen is produced, to take the hydrogen to wherever it needs to be as a fuel source, or whatever. So that's why when conversations are why the building trades, the Boilermakers, the steam fitters, all those trade unions are very much in favor and support the hydrogen hub.
Gentlemen, we just had a text question come in. And yes, we're going to use a text question. I'm going to read it to you. Why are you supportive of unproven technologies when real climate solutions already exist and just need to be deployed?
Okay, I'll take that. And I assume the texter is referring to the hydrogen hub with regard to the unproven technologies. And to an extent, I agree. I think that things like expanding renewables, expanding solar, expanding wind, and energy conservation, these are tried and true and cost-effective ways. And I think you get more bang for your buck when you do that. I mean, we have an alternative energy portfolio standard, and I mentioned my committee's having a hearing on that in December, that is woefully inadequate. It only requires electric distribution companies like PECO or PP&L to use 7% of their energy from renewable sources. Surrounding states really do a much better job and have much higher requirements. But I do think that, I mean, in response to the viewers, that there are certain segments of the economy that you just have to continue, but can't be electrified, can't be fueled by renewable sources, and that's why hydrogen is always a tool in the toolbox, a requirement of those who are concerned with addressing climate change and getting us to carbon neutrality by mid-century.
Senator, what do you think of that text? The viewer said that hydrogen is an unproven technology.
I'm not so sure it's unproven. I mean, I think that there's been research done on it. And hydrogen has been talked about ever since I've been in the Senate. I mean, we're talking about 15 years it's been talked about. This is the first time that there's ever been a major effort or a governmental support for the idea that, here's something we need to look at.
And why is Pennsylvania the only state to get 2 hydrogen projects?
Well, I think Pennsylvania, it's in combination with each of the 2, the Arch 2 and the Mach 2, are groupings with other states. So I do think Pennsylvania has, like a lot of the things that are requirements of a hydrogen hub. They have the feedstock, they have the energy. We have a lot of energy in Pennsylvania, the natural gas, the nuclear, and so forth. You have an existing network of pipelines. You have the labor force. I think Pennsylvania has a lot of the things that are needed for a hydrogen hub already.
Pennsylvania is a net energy producer. We are the energy engine in the whole mid-Atlantic region. We export electricity and PJM is our electric grid. Pennsylvania, Jersey, Maryland, it's 13 states plus the District of Columbia. Pennsylvania produces 25% of the electric power that goes into that grid. Just think about that. 25% comes out of Pennsylvania. So Representative Vitale is right. Pennsylvania has the energy. Pennsylvania has the infrastructure. We're the engine, which is also one of the reasons why we may have more emissions than some other places. We produce things here. I mean, we can get rid of, we can eliminate emissions, just don't produce it. That's kind of what we're doing. We're exporting the emissions to China, frankly, but that's something that Pennsylvania is very, very instrumental in producing all this energy, and we think that we do it at a pretty environmentally safe way or environmentally conscious way compared to what many other countries do. But in any event, that's why the hydrogen hub is here, or at least we attracted those grants to come to Pennsylvania because we do have that energy-rich infrastructure.
What kind of job creation is anticipated here?
Well, I might just sort of backtrack a little bit. I think it's important to note that only 4% of the energy produced in Pennsylvania, 4% comes from renewable sources. So we're really lacking in that regard. So I think with regard to job creation, I think the senator alluded to it with the construction of these plants itself that produce hydrogen, which is going to take an enormous amount of skill sets, engineers and construction workers and the whole gamut, the pipelines that are required. So it's a whole gamut of job creation.
On the subject of a pipeline, then, as far as exporting hydrogen goes, what kind of aspirations would Pennsylvania have to do that?
You mean what kind of, pipelines? That depends where the market is and how far away we would send it. I'm assuming.
Well, producing it is one thing, but you got to get it to market, of course.
And depends where the market is. It could be interstate. It could be here in Pennsylvania. Businesses could use that as an energy source, which is very environmentally friendly.
Yeah, no, I think that the uses talked about, with regard, U.S. Steel, for example, is interested, and steel plants. Pennsylvania has a lot of cement production, trucking, long distance trucking. Things like that are internally. I think when you talk about export, I think about like the construction of liquid natural gas terminals, which would export natural gas, and that's more an issue there. And I think the problem there is when you construct additional liquid natural gas terminals, you are baking in fossil fuel infrastructure that's going to prevent us from really reaching our fossil fuel reduction goals. And not only that, it's going to make natural gas production, the cost of natural gas, more expensive for Pennsylvania producers when you start to ship it overseas, because you're making natural gas its price will float with the international market. If you do not do that, supply and demand dictate it will have a lower price for Pennsylvania. So that's another issue I thought I would just throw in there. This proposed construction of liquid natural gas terminals. One is being proposed in Philadelphia right now.
Now let's take a step back in our discussion, and in the interest of not putting the cart before the horse here, let's consider the demand for hydrogen. How does that market look, and what do we use it for anyway?
I think it could be used for transportation fuel, as we've talked about, if it replaces gasoline or something like that. Now, I agree. The internal combustion engine could run on it. I mean, that's been done for years, and that's just the block has been the availability of enough hydrogen to do that or to go that route. I think that that's the purpose of the hydrogen hubs, to increase the availability of hydrogen, to say, okay, you can now have a fleet of whatever cars that are powered by hydrogen.
Yeah, and let me talk about the things you should not be using hydrogen for. Like, you should not be using it for cars, for example, because there's a better alternative. I mean, with electric vehicles, you should be supplying the electric power grid, generating electricity by renewable energy, wind and solar, and have the cars get their electricity off the grid. With regard to home heating, again, you don't use hydrogen is not the best because there's just better alternatives. Electricity off the grid produced.
Home heating vehicles, they're out in your mind.
Exactly. Yeah. So there's just a lot of things. Just the production of electricity itself. You in the legislation I drafted and in other states, I mean, this idea of blending hydrogen with natural gas to generate electricity, not the best way to do it. Things that shouldn't be happening. So hydrogen it's an expensive technology. It's necessary for limited, narrow uses, but it should not be used, broadly.
Right now, there is no Representative Vitale talked about charging electric cars with solar and wind. The practicalities of it are that right now about 90% of our electric power is generated by other than renewables. It's mainly thermal generation. So we're talking about turning this whole thing around and go completely the other way. And the problem with wind and solar is it's intermittent and it's of limited duration. When I say intermittent, the sun has to be shining. So if the sun isn't particularly shining, it's not going to work. And if the wind's not blowing. So every one of those systems needs a backup system. And right now, the only dependable, reliable backup systems are thermal. And by thermal, I mean anything that will produce steam. It could be nuclear, it could be gas, it could be coal, it could be anything that will produce heat to generate steam. Those are available and can produce power 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Doesn't matter whether it's night, day, or anything like that. And that is the drawback to wind and solar. I am not saying that wind and solar should not be part of the mix, but right now we don't have the technology that we can say we can depend on them. They are not dependable, and they're intermittent. So somewhere along the line we need to work on that. But we need to recognize the fact that we need the thermal generation to answer the question I ask all the time. Where's your power come from at 3 a.m. on a cold, calm winter night? Where's it come from? It's not going to come from wind, and it's not going to come from solar. And batteries, there's been some discussion about batteries, but the technology right now is just not there. And I know there's a project plan for my Senate district. They're talking about 750 megawatts years down the road, but 750 megawatts for 4 hours. Okay, well, that's fine, but what happens if, you need power at 12 a.m., and that would go to 4 a.m., well, what happens to the rest of the time? So as a practical matter, we need thermal. And that's the problem. I talked about the grid, the electric grid, and what's going on with it. The problem is right now we're retiring thermal energy capacity faster, and we're not replacing it. So we're not replacing it with any type of power that answers my 3 a.m. question. And that's a grave concern to me and the committee. Then we've done a lot of studying and research on that.
Gentlemen, I'm going to give you a break just for a minute while we take a look at PCN's programming schedule. The mental health of students is the focus of a news conference we'll bring you tomorrow. It'll be hosted by Senators John Kane and Judy Schwenk. You can watch it on cable or stream it free of charge on PCN Select at 2 p.m. tomorrow. On the issues tomorrow at 6 p.m., the subject is Clean Slate Law. This law gives Pennsylvanians with minor offenses on their record a second chance. Representative Cheryl Delosier explains why she wants the law to be expanded. Then at 6:30 p.m., changes are happening to the state's dog law. Senator Elder Vogel explains what dog owners need to know about licensing and protections that apply when you're buying or adopting a dog. A Journalist Roundtable looks back at the results of last week's general election and what they could mean leading up to the 2024 election. We'll also take a look at what lawmakers in Harrisburg are working on. Kim Lyons, editor at the PA Capitol Star, and Julia Taruso, reporter at the Philadelphia Inquirer, will be the guests. Journalist Roundtable airs on Thursday at 6 p.m. The public affairs coverage you watch on PCN TV is now online free of charge. You can view this programming at PCNTV.com or on our streaming service at PCN Select. PCN is a 501c3 nonprofit television network that receives no funding from the government. Donations from viewers like you help us deliver programming created especially for Pennsylvanians. To make a donation, visit PCNTV.com. Now, we're talking about the environmental impact of making energy here with the chairman of the environmental committees in our legislature. Representative Vitale, I know your committee had a hearing yesterday about hydrogen, and what was the committee trying to find out?
Well, I think we were trying to examine hydrogen hubs as it relates to addressing climate change. We are trying to make the point through various speakers that hydrogen hubs can be done the right way or the wrong way. Mm-hmm. They can be done in a way that just perpetuates natural gas and fossil and CO2 emissions. If you're not, if you're using natural gas and you're not capturing carbon to a sufficient degree, or can be done the right way if you are either capturing CO2 or using renewable sources to do that. So the purpose of the hearing was to look at hydrogen hubs not just from the job perspective, as many people are wont to do, but from the climate perspective. And we had
what kind of groups testified? Yeah.
We had a lot of good groups. We had a senator from Illinois testify about legislation in that state to do that. We had a representative from Colorado who had legislation. We had a very knowledgeable representative from the National Resource Defense Council, Rachel Fakery. We had Rob Altenberg from Penn Future.
What did you learn from their testimony then? What did you find surprising or especially helpful yesterday from the hearing yesterday?
Well, I had some concerns with carbon capture, and the National Resource Defense Council representative gave me some assurance that that is coming along. Her response to my question with regard to the feasibility of carbon capture was a little more positive than I had anticipated. So that was one result. But we're trying to just make that. Put that message out there to the general public that we have to do this the right way, because I mean the reality, just coming back to something that the senator said about continuing, or at least implied with regard to continuing the use of thermal energy and fossil fuel, is we have to get to carbon neutrality by mid-century to avoid the worst effects of climate change. I read an article recently that said the last 12 months, ending in October, were the hottest year in the history of this planet. And you just look at these increasingly bad consequences, the wildfires, the superstorms, the floods, and so forth. Continuing to burn natural gas at its current rate is not the answer. I mean, wind and solar, I mean, I disagree that they're not proven technologies. And although the wind might not be blowing in one area, if you have wind scattered throughout a multi-state area, it's blowing somewhere. And with regard to solar, again, this idea of storage is something. It's a developing technology and the efficiency of storage. So we really have to address the climate situation facing our planet.
So, Senator, how do you respond to a lot of the things that Representative Vitale said, especially about the future of natural gas?
First of all, climate change is here. It's been going on for millions of years, and it's not going to change. I mean, we have an obligation to be good stewards while we're here, to not deliberately do things. I mean, every time I see the picture of the all the plastic floating in the ocean, I think, that's something that we can pay attention to. Here's Representative Vitale is talking about, in the future we can do all these things. I'm more concerned about what happens right now. And my entire philosophy is based on, there's three parts. We need energy, and with energy we can build an economy, and once we have an economy, we can worry about the environment. And they have to come in that order. If you're worried about, am I going to have a meal today, or am I going to be able to eat? And this applies around the world. And that's why some of the things that are happening right now, that's why China has 100 coal-fired power plants under construction. They're trying to build an economy for billions of people. And eventually, they may get to the point of worrying about the environment. Here in Pennsylvania, I'm worried about, we have energy, and we need to take that energy to build our economy. And what I am concerned about right now here in Pennsylvania is our electric grid. And I mentioned that before. We almost lost the electric grid last year in Winter Storm Elliott. 99.9% of the people out there don't have any idea how close we came to blackouts. I want to avoid that, and we've worked very closely with PJM. We've had hearings working with Ohio, legislators in Ohio, as to what we can do. As I mentioned before, Pennsylvania is a huge energy producer for the region. We have to maintain our energy production actually to serve the other states. Now, and it's really interesting, what state policy does affects Pennsylvania. For example, Illinois has decided they want to go all green. Okay, that's fine. That affects the transmission lines in Ohio. Ohio raised the question, well, why should our citizens pay for that? Pennsylvania is going to face the same issue right now. There's a power plant right outside of Baltimore. It's going to close, called Brand Shores. Yesterday or day before, I think FERC released what it's going to cost to close that, in the transmission lines that are going to need to be rebuilt, $800 million. A large part of that is going to be paid by Pennsylvanians. Now, so what we're saying is the energy policies, the way that we are working, and Representative Vitale mentioned this about wind and other areas and things, but policies that are made in other states affect Pennsylvania. That's what I'm concerned about, protecting Pennsylvanians, protecting our energy background, and with energy and the economy. Yes, I want to worry about the environment, but I'm worried about keeping the lights on. What do we need to do environmentally to meet that right now? And it's a bigger issue than what people think.
Yeah, so I think we've come down to a fundamental difference between, our respective sides. I mean, I think what the senator said at the outset was, climate change has been going on for thousands of years, or something to that effect. But I think that is the equivalent of being a climate denier, I would say, because we are talking about something very different. We are talking about the increase in CO2, the dramatic increase from the 1850s and the advent of the Industrial Revolution. And if you believe the consensus of the world's atmospheric scientists, this is something new and different and man-made and has to be addressed now. And if climate change didn't exist, I'd be agreeing with everything the senator said. But the reality is, I subscribe to sound science. Sound science tells us we have a serious problem, an inconvenient truth, and I think we have to deal with it. And we have to take steps to gradually, not irresponsibly, I'm concerned my constituents will go crazy if their power went out, and I get that. But we have to deal with this transition to away from fossil fuels in a responsible way to address, what sound science tells us.
Viewers, you still have about 10 minutes to call or text our program. I'll give you the numbers again. To call us, 1-877-PA6-5001, or if you care to text us, 717-219-4001. Well, let's talk more about greenhouse gas emissions, and immediately that brings to my mind a controversial program, and there was some news about this recently, about the RGGI, Regional Greenhouse Gas Emissions. And before we go into recent developments on that program, very quickly and in simple terms, what are its aspirations?
Well, it's a cap and trade program.
That means
it involves the Mid-Atlantic and New England states, 11 states, and it's directed only at the power sector, not transportation. And the approach, and it's went into effect in 2009, so it's tried and true, proven. And what it does is participating states set a cap on the overall greenhouse gas emissions from the power sector, and then reduce that by about 3% every year to gradually shrink it. And a market is created. This is a market-based approach, which should appeal to conservatives. And you have to buy a credit, which is the equivalent of a ton of CO2.
Emissions have to be paid for, in effect.
Exactly. You have to buy these credits, and these credits are traded on a marketplace created by this company called Reggie, and it really forces companies to be the most efficient as possible as far as producing energy in a greenhouse gas responsible way, and gradually shifting over time. So the most efficient producers of energy with less greenhouse gas over time will be those who succeed. So,
Senator Yaw, before we get into the news in this program, how do you see it?
I think it's a big fallacy because the RGGI states, the states that are members of that, are states that import energy. And the irony of it is Pennsylvania would join. Pennsylvania is a producer and an exporter, and we're going to have the importers tell us how our energies can be produced, that we send them. That just kind of makes no sense to me whatsoever. But Reggie, I asked about it during the budget hearings this year. Nobody could tell me what Reggie is. Reggie is a Delaware corporation that has its offices in New York City. And I said, well, who runs it? Who picks the chair of Reggie? Well, nobody knew. I mean, it's just a failure.
Let's try to get a phone call in here, gentlemen. And this one is from Greensburg. Mary, you're on PCN.
Hi, thank you for taking my call. I think I'm somewhat echoing Senator Yaw's sentiments here. This is Western Pennsylvania. We're heavily rich in gas and coal, still some coal in this area. And shouldn't we just try to improve the technology around what we have? Because we don't have the technology here right now to do the solar and wind If you go down, you'll see even the mountains over in Somerset that have the windmills, they're not always turning, but I think the point is well taken that the gas, and the other thing is this creates excellent local jobs that we have the infrastructure to maintain, as opposed to investment that we don't have anybody wanting to make right now.
Representative Vitale, can you start us on that?
Right.
Since you might have an opposing view.
Right. So one of the benefits of RGGI, companies who pay this tax, that creates a fund of money. I think Governor Shapiro estimated in his budget almost like $600 million for the current year. That fund can be used to create jobs, sort of helping the transition from areas that are producing outdated fossil fuels like coal, and move towards, energy sources of the future. So this fund, this RGGI-created fund, will help in the transition. I think, Mary and I appreciate the fact that this is, the livelihood of your community, and no one's expecting that natural gas stop, immediately or anytime soon. But at the same time, this impetus, this climate change impetus, requires us to start to make that transition.
Gentlemen, we only have about 2 minutes left in our program, so let's try to get some closure on RGGI, because there was a recent court ruling that kind of stopped the whole idea in its tracks. What was the issue for the court, and what is likely to happen next?
Well, the issue for the court was whether the governor could do it without legislative approval. And, the next step would be if the governor decides he's going to appeal it to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court.
Representative Vitale, any insight as to if he'll do this?
Yeah, we certainly hope he will appeal it, because because the reality is the legislature has demonstrated they really are unwilling to address climate change, and so it has to be done through administrative action. And this is probably one of the most important things out there that can be done to address climate change.
That'll have to be the last word, because we're out of time. Our guests have been majority chairs of the environmental committees in Pennsylvania's legislature, Greg Vitale for the House of Representatives, and Gene Yaw for the Senate. Thank you both. Earlier, I talked to the PA Fish and Boat Commissioner about a new license plate that features the state amphibian. Tell us about this creature called the Eastern Hellbender.
Yeah, so happy to, and thanks for the opportunity. It's our state amphibian. We had never had a state amphibian until 2019, and our friend Senator Gene Yaw from up in Lycoming County introduced the bill. It was a really neat effort to have it be designated the state amphibian. The Chesapeake Bay Foundation has a student leadership program, and it was a group of high school students that said, hey, wait a minute, you got a state mammal, you got a state fish, we ought to have a state amphibian. And the Eastern Hellbender was certainly a worthy candidate for it. It's the largest amphibian in North America. You've got some species that can live up to 2 feet long, up to 2 pounds. Very long-lived, can live up to 50 years, and they like clean water. I mean, so what better ambassador for water quality in Pennsylvania than a species that's big, interesting looking, and needs good clean water.
So what's unique about the Eastern Hellbender? And besides, how did he get such an intriguing name?
I don't know how he got the name. That's a good question. The nickname, I've got some unglamorous nicknames: snot otter, lasagna lizards. And if you can imagine, when we worked with our partners at the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources to design the new license plate that I know we're going to talk about, it wasn't like, paint this bird or something like that. It was a pretty unique challenge for them. So I don't know how they got the name, but what really makes them interesting, one is their size, right? I mean, it's a really large creature. You're not going to see them very often, but when you do, the habitats that you see them in, they need large rock structures that they can live under. Their primary prey are crayfish. Throughout the year, they will feed on other species, but they'll look for a body of water, of flowing water that has a good crayfish population. They're in 32 of our 67 counties. You got some of our species that are more confined to certain one range or another, but they are pretty well widespread. And again, just with the name and with the look and with the size and the charisma of it, no better candidate than to appear on the third species ever on our Wild Resource Conservation Program license plates.
Tim, the name Eastern Hellbender makes him sound kind of, dangerous or menacing. So just tell me in reality, what kind of disposition does this creature have?
Yeah, they're pretty docile, and like most things in nature, they really don't want anything to do with you. They are pretty reclusive. They tend to be nocturnal, so you're probably not going to see them. That's when they'll be out feeding, largely at night. They're pretty solitary. And the fact that they are into those large rock substrates, they're difficult to see. I will say, if you do see one, we ask you to please not disturb them. And, if you mishandle them, it could be detrimental to the species. Another reason we like you to, let them have their place is they're doing pretty well in Pennsylvania. They're a species of concern, but they're not threatened. They're not endangered. And we, along with our partners, like to do everything we can to keep common species common, keep them off the endangered species list. It's a lot easier to deal with the species before it gets in the emergency room. And happy to say that the Eastern Hellbender's not there, and where we have the good water quality and good substrate, you have a good chance you may see one.
Now, Tim, I've lived in Pennsylvania all my life, and I've never heard of an Eastern Hellbender until just recently. So tell me, where can I find the greatest concentration of this animal in Pennsylvania?
Yeah, well, again, we talked about the water quality and the substrate that they need. Northwestern Pennsylvania. French Creek is a really, really famous stream up in watershed up in northwestern Pennsylvania. Really, really biodiverse with a lot of mussel species. Good chance you might see the one there in the French Creek drainage. The upper parts of the Susquehanna River drainage, where Senator Yaw, who took the lead on the legislation, you could see them there in Lycoming and Clinton counties up in north central Pennsylvania. Typically, the habitat and the water quality and temperatures favor them more in northern Pennsylvania than you would down around here.
Now let's talk about the license plate, Tim, and how does the Eastern Hellbender or the state of Pennsylvania benefit from this creature being on this new license plate?
Right. So the Wild Resource Conservation Program, Wild Resource Conservation Fund, was created in 1982 as a tax checkoff. And about 25 years ago, we had our first license plate, which was the saw-whet owl, and you still see a couple of those around. Saw-whet owl then moved to the river otter, and then the river otter is going to be retired next year, and the Eastern Hellbender will be on the license plate. And for $41, you can get the new license plate, and $15 from the cost of each of those license plate goes into the Wild Resource Conservation Fund. That is a fund that's administered by the Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission, Pennsylvania Game Commission, DCNR, and it's really focused on non-game species and rare plants. So think of species that aren't hunted or fished for. Really that's what we use, licensed dollars as a focus on, trout, bass, in our case, Game Commission, white-tailed deer, wild turkeys, that sort of thing. But there are a whole host of species out there that are not hunted or fished for that really merit our conservation. And in Pennsylvania, we have 22 species of salamanders, 21 snakes, 18 frogs, 13 turtles, and 4 different lizard species. A lot of people are surprised when you hear those numbers. Wild Resource Conservation Fund helps to provide money for research as well as management to keep those species common and to make sure that they don't become threatened or endangered.
Last question, Tim. How was this license plate designed? Somebody has to come up with just the right picture to put on the license plate, something that can be appreciated by the vehicle that's in back of the vehicle with this license plate?
Sure. Yeah, so a couple things. It used to be when the first 2 generations of the Wild Resource Conservation Program, it was the whole. In fact, I have a river otter on my car out in the parking lot. That was the whole license plate. I think it was primarily driven by the state police in the different states, and had all these different various plates. Like, you couldn't tell that's a Pennsylvania plate or a New York plate. So it's going to be a square that's on the license plate that depicts the Hellbender. We worked with artists that work for DCNR to come up with it. We then shared it with biologists and others to make sure that it was an accurate depiction. And we're really happy with how it turned out. And to be honest with you, the example I use, I think I could say this. Remember the old Hell of a Good Dip commercials where the kids would say it's naughty to say, but it's, it's naughty to say, but it's fun to eat something like that. It's intriguing. Like, when you hear the word hellbender, like, wait a minute, that sort of catches your eye, and like, are you serious? That's what it's really called. So I think there'll be a little bit of intrigue with even just, it's sort of fun to say, that might attract people to buy this thing.
Tim Schaefer, Pennsylvania's Fish and Boat Commissioner, thank you.
You bet. Thanks for the opportunity.
One more thing before we wrap up today, a reminder about On the Issues tomorrow. First at 6 p.m., the subject will be Clean Slate Law. This law gives Pennsylvanians with minor offenses on their record a second chance. Representative Cheryl Delosier explains why she wants the law to be expanded. Then at 6:30 p.m., changes are happening to the state's dog law. Senator Elder Vogel explains what dog owners need to know about licensing and protections that apply when you're buying or adopting a dog. That's it for the PCN Capitol Preview. I'm Larry Kasper. Thanks for watching.